This is the fourth session of this wonderful conference. Many thanks to the organizers, all of you. The first speaker will be Kaidi Krisa. She is the one sitting here, yes. Language change in the 17th century Dorpat University's academic writings. Student scholarship applications as exceptional examples of code switching. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, and I'm really glad to start today's second session, in which I'm going to talk shortly about language shift which took place on those scholarship applications written by students. And I will start with giving you briefly a background how did those chants look like, and then I go on with this language change in those applications. For scholars in Europe especially, the early modern period is recognized as an era when Latin held a dominant position in almost each and every sphere of the academic world, being intimately involved in the life of an educated man. The use of lingua latina was a test of the erudition and wisdom of a person, and it was customary that both the language of communication and of learning of intellectuals was to a great extent Latin-based. In this respect, the 17th century Academy of Tartu, Dorpat, was no exception. At least that is what we tend to believe on the basis of the existing and accessible reference literature of that time. When analyzing the 17th century academic writings of the University of Tartu from the aspect of historical language change, one can see that code switching was a rather often used practice, both in the printed materials from the teaching sphere, like disputations, orations, dissertations, as well as within different kinds of letters. But as a counterweight to printed materials where Latin was used as the dominant language, as you can see here, a dominant or so-called matrix language, the linguistic situation in manuscripts, for example, in the personal letters, was in most cases just the opposite. As a matrix or a frame language, some vernaculars like Swedish or German were used, and Latin was more or less used as the second or embedded language. And Latin is pointed green there, and you can see the proportions. Now, amongst all the handwritten academic material from the last decade of the 17th century University of Tartu, an interesting and rather exceptional subgenre of letters occurred. A group of students' handwritten scholarship applications, which are important in the sense of the customary linguistic practice of all such like letters. Those applications are prevalently written in visually beautiful calligraphical Latin, with just a few exceptions where code switching was used. And there are some examples of those additional scholarship applications which really look picturesque. As a remark, it has to be mentioned here that code switching or language shift is the mixing of words, phrases, and sentences from two distinct grammatical systems across sentence boundaries within the same text. So the other term I used already is the matrix language, which is dominating language in a code switch text, and in those occasions I'm dealing with here, this matrix language is Swedish or either German. And embedded language is this secondary language in a code switch text, which in those examples is Latin. This kind of language use, on the other hand, clearly deviates from the conventional letter writing tradition in all the other types of academic letters from the 17th century University of Tartu. As mentioned before, conventional languages to be used in letter genre were predominantly vernaculars, yet there are 6 applications out of more than 180 written in 1690s, where in some reason applications written in a rather unconventional way, not in Latin, as the majority of such like applications as you saw before, but almost entirely in vernacular languages, thus resembling more to the style of personal letters and not so much to the scholarship applications. As you can see here, I have underlined all the cases of where Latin occurs, and there's transcription of one application as well, and Latin is marked green there. Now, according to the Senate protocols of Academia Gustaviana, distinction between different levels or degrees of scholarships was made. For instance, students wrote applications in order to be elevated to the class with higher rank to get bigger sum of money as a grant. It's interesting that 3 applicants out of those 6, which are written here, who used code switching, asked not just for a scholarship, but namely the raise of it. Those students who had better results in their studies and also were from the lower classes of society were more likely to get scholarship as well. Now, taking this information into consideration, when analyzing the content of the texts, one can easily say that they are rather entertaining to read. In some cases, applications can be seen as double-sided beneficial agreements between students and the university's officials. One student, Stratovius, for example, vows in his application to the rector that if he would be granted, he would not leave the university before he will promote it. Every applicant have at least once mentioned living in poverty too, to perhaps get a scholarship out of rectors and professors' pity. Hence, it has to be mentioned that all of those 6 applicants did get granted with scholarships. When analyzing this material, a question that might arise is why? Why did the 17th century university students change their language within one rather strictly formed genre of writing such as scholarship applications, in those applications they most often could show the great knowledge of Latin to the application's addressees, who were the rector, senate, or professors? I think it could not be due to lack of their Latin knowledge as the students, in order to be immatriculated to the Academia Gustavo Carolina in the 17th century, had to take a Latin exam. Perhaps it was general writing practice to resemble more to the later genre. Students' origin could not influence the language choice either, because most of the students in 1690s were predominantly of Swedish or German origin. If it did influence their choice, then why? Why the rest of the students did not use the same practice? It would have been easier for them to use their mother tongue instead of Latin, I guess. Or did language shifting then somehow guarantee them getting their scholarship? As seen above, not really. All those applicants who did use code switching or language shift, they did get granted. So those are just a few questions and speculations which might arise when analyzing those 6 rather exceptional code switch students' scholarship applications. 5 students out of those 6, as you can see here, prefer to use Swedish as the matrix or the dominant language, and just 1 chose to use German instead. Now, if we look at the length of their writings, we can see that the green chart, we can see that it varies from the number of words from 135 to 554, and their content is divided between 23 to 56 lines per application. Thus, a correlation between the number of words and the lines is evident, as you can see from here. Now, when comparing those applications to one another, it occurs that in each and every writing, Latin has been embedded to the matrix language, which is either Swedish or German. Latin is marked as in red charts there. Based on this, it is evident that the average frequency of the use of Latin varies by letters. In the first one, maybe it simplifies, the first one, Latin is used in every 4th or 5th line, so that every 30th single word is in Latin. In the only German written supplication, which is this second one, Latin is used the most seldom in every 10th line, so that every 97th word is in Latin. Almost equally are Latin words divided into Swedish letters, which are Röhrling's and Sjöström's applications. After every 10th word, language shifting occurs. In one of the shortest applications, which is Sudermark's, Latinized forms occur in every 7th line, so that every 60th word is switched. the most variating supplication is also the longest one by Castinius, which is the fifth one here. Within its 554 words, language shift occurs in every second line, so that every 10th word is in Latin, as you can see from here. Now, regardless of the previous examples that clearly show rather scant use of code switching, with just one exception, which is this Castinius application, there are yet clear indications of its use in each and every letter, which in turn shows the chance openness to code switching. This statement can be proved when comparing the frequency of Latin words used in scholarship applications to personal letters from the 1690s, and there is one example. From this transcription next to the photo, which is on the right, it is clear that the use of Latin words in personal letters is not much higher from the same use in applications, which was almost the same if you take the percentage. Or other words, when comparing the frequency of code switching in those scholarship applications with the analogous phenomenon occurred in printed material, like dissertations, disputations, and orations, as mentioned before, the percentage of code switching per writing is almost the same, nearly 3% in all of the scholarship applications, and approximately 2 to 3% in printed dissertations and disputations from the 1690s. Even though the number of Latin words used within vernacular text is not very high, it clearly shows, on the basis of those rather conventional applications, that academia was not conservative towards mixing classical and vernacular languages within one text, but was rather open towards code switching and language change, even though if that practice was unconventional. Now, but there is difference. Unlike the printed material, where the language shifting is marked with introductory formulas, for example, uiti igitur in vernaculo nostro sermone, etc., in letters, not once analogous practice is used. As you can see here, there's no formulas when they're shifting or to occur to the shiftings. Instead of that, writing style differs where language shift has taken place, or most of the cases it does differ. Now, in order to make a generalization on the application style, one has to analyze the types of Latin words or phrases used within such like writings. To start with, the introductory and ending parts in both the applications written entirely in Latin and in those written in vernaculars are letter-like, full of laudatory adjectives addressed most often to the rector and professors of the university. In those parts, the most common Latin allocution is directed to the rector, rector magnifica, and in some cases, professors as addressees are stressed in Latin too. In those applications, such like phrases are interpolated to the vernacular written frame language. Thus, when letter is written almost entirely in Swedish, then those allocutions can be considered as intersentential code switching. In the main text, the average length of code switched places are one-word-long segments referring mostly to the laudatory phrases like magnificentia, which occurs in all of the Swedish matrix language applications, but not once on the German letter, as you can see the yellow chart here. And the German text is here. As you can see, the column of the fifth application, written by Castinius, this one here, it comprises the most of the laudatory phrases 9 times, which means that in every 6th line he addresses to the rector and the senate of the university. This practice makes his writing the most polite one, but on the other hand, it's the most clumsy one by its style too. It means that he basically re-asks the same question whether he would get a scholarship or not over and over again. And due that, to me as a reader, his style seems a bit too importunate. At least it has not led to forget his aim of the supplication, which, on the other hand, is not very wrong either. The second division, if you look at the blue charts or columns here, it stands for Latin verbs that are shifted into the vernacular texts. 3 authors out of 6 use Latin verbs in some parts of their applications instead of Swedish or German, most likely for accentuating their thoughts, seldom for synonymy. As one example, within one text, besides one another, there are phrases like in Latin dupliciter and Swedish dubbel, which means the same, but in order to accentuate or stress their thoughts. The most often are these used by Castinius, whose letter is also the linguistically the most interesting, comprises, in addition to the laudatory phrases and Latin verbs, also a variety of longer Latin phrases, such as quotis vertor non aufertor, and he mixes it with Swedish too, so it would be smoother to read. For example, at homo proponit, men deus disponit. In comparison to the other authors' applications, where the most switches are situational shiftings made on a single word level, such as Latinized introductory words or phrases, some verbs and conjunctives, as mentioned before, Castinius is the only one who code switches between Swedish and Latin most frequently, as you can see and as you saw, and, unlike other applicants, creates also shorter mixed language units while mixing Swedish with Latin. And this also shows that his code switching is the most well planned, I guess. Now, trying to sum it all up, or how to conclude this code switching or language change within those scholarship applications, I think that even though those 6 scholarship applications, at which I tried to give you a shorter overview, they were written unlike the other Latin-based letters of this genre, that is unconventional in vernacular, writers such like choice did not preclude them of getting scholarships. So we can only assume that all of the authors were aware of language shifting and used it as a rather common writing practice, resembling more to the style of personal letters that were written almost entirely in vernaculars. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation, and I would have hoped we had more time to comment on it. But questions? Yes, Jannica.
Thank you. I have one.
Jannica.
I have one question concerning methodology. Do you discern between code switching and switching the register, the low and high and middle, and because I had an impression that you don't discern it, because I think it's still important to draw the line between the change of register and just the practice of domesticating Latin terminology in your own language.
That is a really good question. In that presentation, I did actually differentiate that. But if you take this general analysis of that topic and take all the texts which have different genres, then it's of great essence to make this differentiation of registries, most definitely. But here I didn't put it in. But thank you for this question.
Thank you very much. Some other question? You have a small one.
I have a small one about drawing lines.
Yeah.
Isn't it hard sometimes to draw the line between Swedish and Latin? Because many Latin words are loan words into Swedish, and there are no other Swedish words, but at that time you used the Latin word in Swedish.
In Swedish.
So how do you handle that?
Well, if you take a genre...
That was a tough question.
That is a bit tough question, but it's easy when we take dissertations or the printed material, because then we see the shift is totally different, and when the word is, let's say, the part of the sentence is written in Swedish, then I've taken those, even though maybe they're Latinized words which are taken over into Swedish, I've considered those as Swedish words. Even though perhaps I should think should draw the line. It's much more difficult if you take those manuscripts, like this example I made, dupliciter and tupel, which are, of course,
And you have the Swedish
the
alternative.
Swedish alternative, and actually this alternative was inside this text, and they were actually next to one another. This synonym was given, and in these cases, again, I actually didn't draw that line. I took when in the Swedish text Latin, when the word was Latinized, I considered it as one and not vice versa. And perhaps, yeah, in other works or this work I'm going to continue, I should draw that line much more
Okay,
carefully.
thank you. I think we will have to continue now. The next subject is classical values in Riga Dome School. That is indeed a great subject, and we have two speakers, Gita Versina and Brigitta Sirola. The one who is yes, you will speak, and if you
It's me speaking.
only you will speak. Okay.
So, good morning. So, yesterday we already heard something about the Dome School of Riga from Professor Ojar Slams. So, today, together with Gita Berzina, we are going to give closer insight into the values honored in the Dome School of Riga in the 16th century. Classical heritage, with its manifold ideas and values, as we know, is at the basis of humanism, and without it, this intellectual movement cannot be imagined. Considering Studia Humanitatis as the highest manifestation of intellectual gratification and human esteem, as well as the way of life saturated with moral, ethical activity, humanists base themselves on the acquisition of classical languages and cultural values of antiquity. They indulged in studying texts of ancient Greek philosophers, orators, prose and poetry texts of classical authors, as well as Holy Script. Changes in the intellectual life spreading across Europe during the 15th and 16th centuries reached also its northern territories and were disseminated in Livonia and its metropolis Riga during the 16th century. In Livonia, the process was reinforced by Lutheran Reformation, which led to favorable conditions for the advance of education, giving classics an important place in the curriculum of Riga Dome School, which became one of the most important educational establishments in this part of Europe. The aim of the present paper is to indicate the way how classical values and ideas found their place in Riga Dome School in the 16th century. The history of Riga Dome School goes back to the beginning of the 13th century, but in the 16th century, the school underwent significant changes. In 1528, the city of Riga, which was now predominantly Protestant, took charge of this oldest and most popular school in Riga and transformed it into a Protestant school. The post of rector of the Dome School was held by illustrious persons, most of them coming from German cities. They led the Dome School through political and confessional conflicts, through the wars and plagues of the 16th century, until the school was at the height of its renown towards the end of that century. Their humanistic education, acquired in the greatest universities of Europe, undoubtedly determined the classically oriented course the school was to follow. Jacob Bat, a native of the Netherlands, who had studied in Leuven, in Paris and in Spain, played an important role in establishing pedagogical traditions in the Dome School. But in 1528, Jacob Bach came to Riga from Wittenberg with recommendations from Luther and Melanchthon to become the first rector of the Protestant Dome School. Jacob Bach is also known to have been a keen advocate of ancient culture. In consequence, classical learning became dominant in the Dome School. The teaching of Latin, Greek, Hebrew first found its place in a 3-year gymnasium. Towards the end of his life, Jacob Bach donated his private library, which contained many works from classical antiquity to the Dome School. Works by Aristoteles, Herodotus, Caesar, Homerus, Plinius, Plutarchus, Hippocrates, Galenus, and many others. Gradually, the Dome School became the higher Latin school, teaching ancient literature, works by Middle Age enlighteners, grammar, metrics, mathematics, as well as the basics of ancient languages. Later on, also such subjects as physics, history, and geography. But the middle of the century does not seem to have been a favorable time for the growth of the school. The political conflicts of the period of the Livonian War left their mark on the school. The Dome School was drawn into the rivalry between several political currents raging in Riga. The school reacted in its own classical way to this rivalry. We know that these political controversies were ridiculed in a Latin drama with a seemingly innocent title, The Fight of the Horati and the Curati for Alba Longa. It is known that this play was, with political tendencies, was written by Rector George Marceau and staged in 1576. But once started, dramatic art at the Dome School continued to flourish, and many other plays were put on during subsequent years. In 1582, the year when the city of Riga surrendered to Poland, the age of the Counter-Reformation started. Disputes between the city council and the citizens grew greater. In 1583, rector of the Dome School was Henry Meller, and during the 5 years Meller was rector, the Dome School was involved in conflicts which were caused by the introduction of the Gregorian calendar. At the beginning of 1584, unrest broke out, known to history as the Calendar Revolts. After these revolts, Henry Meller was made to leave Riga, but shortly before his departure, he compiled a small ethical anthology of instructions dealing with school regulations, some of them in verse. This booklet of classical instructions widely reflects the reception and acquisition of classical values in the Dome School. It was printed by Nikolai Molin's printing shop in 1589 under the title Libellus Ethicus. These are oldest ethical instructions written in Latin for the use of Riga Dome School. Poems, orations, maxims, and sententiae of various authors on the virtues of pupils are added. At the beginning, there are some verse lines by poet Claudianus on the utility of ethics, and you can see an interesting figure on the left. The booklet contains school regulations defined by German humanist Adam Sieber, Leges Scholasticae Adami Sieberi. In more than 100.5 verse lines, pupils are urged to observe piety and display veneration, to be obedient and honor parents at home, and to be polite and diligent at school. There are reflections by other authors on virtues of pupils, for example, by poet Nicolaus Borbonius. Carmen Borboni consists of more than 300 elegiac lines, and it gives a lot of instructions, many of them quite practical, but Paraenesis is a prose text which also abounds in its instructions, such as how to start a day, how to behave at school, how to observe modesty, but most of them are offered as sententiae. For example, legere enim et non intelligere negligere est. Some of Cicero's maxims were also added under the title Sententiae Ciceronianae, puerorum ingenis moribus atque studiis recte formandis accommodatae, as well as Oratia Ciceronis pro archia poeta. Cicero's maxims are short quotations selected from various Cicero's writings, and they cover different fields. For example, philosophy, which is dux vitae, literature studies, which are the food of youth, the delight of old age, the ornament of prosperity, the refuge and comfort of adversity, a delight at home and no hindrance abroad. They are companions by night and in travel and in the country, so Cicero in his Proarchia Poeta. Also maxims on memory, which is described as thesaurus omnium rerum, on diligence, diligentia in omnibus rebus plurimum valet, on liberty, which is potestas vivendi, also on virtue, on human dignity, on the power of conscience, and many other. The booklet ends with Oratiuncul Arnoldi Bureni de literarum humanitatis dignitate et usu rostohi habita, which permits to think that such school regulations were characteristic of the period in the humanistic schools of Europe. All the texts included in Libellus Ethicus in one or another way reflect such ideas as human esteem, human potential, the potential for creative growth of individuals, the harmony of physical and mental growth, human progress, and personal liberty. These ideas, so common and understandable in antiquity, but neglected in the darkness of the Middle Ages, raised undivided interest in the age of humanism and consequently in Riga Dome School as well. The school managed to survive through different collisions and to flourish at the end of the century. The Jesuit College, which was founded in Riga in 1583, played a part in the conflict between the city council and Dome School's rector Müller. The activities of the Jesuits in Riga in the mid-80s of the 16th century led to concern in the city council, which now risked losing control of the sphere of education. This risk was very real, since also the European universities now demanded a higher standard of their new students, and the citizens of Riga were no longer satisfied with the results obtained at the Dome School. Thus, the necessity appeared to reorganize the school. Reorganization took place in 1594 under the guidance of two learned men, scholars, David Hilchen, the syndic, and Nicolaus Ecke, the burgomaster. They were both persons of great merit, not only in the political history of Riga, but also in the cultural life of the city and of Livonia. Since the printing shop, the growth of the city library, and the reorganization of the Dome School would hardly have been possible without their direct help. There were three aspects to the reorganization of the Dome School. Firstly, the 3-year gymnasium was transformed into a 5-year Latin school. Secondly, a school curriculum was established, and thirdly, school results were improved, thus preparing pupils for university studies. This reorganization started the transition of the school into the status of an academic gymnasium. The opening festivities of the reorganized Dome School took place on the 18th of July, 1594, with speeches by David Hilchen, Nicolaus Ecke, and Johann Rivius. These speeches, together with a detailed instruction of programs and curricula, were later printed in a special collection under the title Orationes Tres. We needn't stress the importance of this publication for the history of the Dome School. Here the three speakers set out the future tasks and aims of the school. Nicolaus Ecke began his speech by reminding his listeners of the merits of the past, of those who had gone before, Maiores nostri, quorum memoria sit in benedictione. According to him, the task of the school was to train the pupils in piety and wisdom, so that the city council and the citizens might rejoice in school leavers who are, as said by Ecke, non modo literati sed etiam moribus exculti atque elegantes. David Hilchen saw wisdom and eloquence, sapientiam, and eloquentia as the aim of education and training. He says, Duo sunt qua in homine ut homo est, atque ut huius divini animalis conditio postulat, principaliter desiderantur, unum quidem ut sapiet, alterum vero ut polite eloquatur. If this aim is to be fulfilled, the city council, the parents, pupils, and teachers must all attend to definite duties and undertake definite obligations. The city council takes care of the school in bounden duty, and therefore it may rightfully demand understanding from school as well as the homes. The homes must beware lest they hinder or altogether destroy what the school has exerted itself to create. Johann Rivius addressed the meeting as a third speaker. His rhetorically elaborated speech was most vivid and suggestive, since Rivius reminded his listeners about the values of classical heritage which were to be acquired in the reorganized school. He, in a truly Ciceronian manner, insisted on the union of philosophy and rhetoric, on close union of good, honorable content, and perfect, magnificent form. Rivius demanded diligence and advocated the study of Plato and Aristoteles because, as he puts it, extractatione literarum quibus ingenium excolitur conciliatur ista quam quaerimus cordis et linguae conjunctio. Rivius already in great detail speaks about skillful, impressive speaking qualities, emphatically and widely resorting to ancient sources, quoting ancient authors, Horatius, for example, Horatius and Juvenal, and mentioning Pericles, Demosthenes, and of course Cicero as ideals to be followed and imitated. Thus, the collection Orationes Tres provides us with a fairly clear picture of the values important for the renovated Dome School. As we can see from the extant school curriculum, if you can see, the subjects taught at the school were varied. So this is prima. They betray the influence of European humanistic schools. The acquisition of religious and classical disciplines seems to have been equally important. The pupils were expected to learn the catechism in both German and Latin, as well as to study extracts from the Gospel and the Psalms. But the significance of language learning, for example, German, Latin, and Greek, is also stressed by the three orators. Other subjects were the syntax and etymology of Latin and Greek, the study of classical authors, included such Greek authors as Lucianos, Plutarchos, Xenophon, Isocrates, Demosthenes, Homerus, Theognis, Theocritus, and Sophocles, while the Latin authors on the syllabus were Cicero, Caesar, Sallustius, Livius, Tacitus, Ovidius, Vergilius, and Terentius. The predominance of Greek and Latin is obvious. Purely practical subjects are not mentioned in the curriculum. A more detailed account of the curriculum of the Dome School would require a separate discussion, but there can be no doubt that this curriculum testifies to the level of classical learning achieved at the Dome School towards the end of the 16th century. Books used in the process of learning give evidence of the way various disciplines were acquired and of the importance of classical values proposed in the Dome School. It is known that the Latin language was studied according to Aelius Donatus' Grammatices Rudimenta, but for the study of the Greek language, Elementa Linguae Graecae by Dome School conrector Thomas Hockendorf was used. A part of books were brought from Europe, and a part of them were compiled and published in Riga. As for example, the book Ciceronis Epistolarum Libri Tres, which was compiled after the model of Johannes Sturmius' Epistolarum Libri Tres, was published in Riga in 1614 for the needs of the Dome School. The book contains texts well selected for the use in teaching process from different Cicero's letters to his family members as well as to his friends. Not only Cicero's letters, but also his orations were widely used in the process of learning. The collection comprising, comprising some of Cicero's orations in the Academic Library of Riga. The extant collection shows that a great attention was paid also to the acquisition of prosody and the heritage of ancient poets. So, no time more, but they selected ideas of classical authors, selected verse lines of Roman poets included in different collections, obviously and vividly reveal life perception as a period of a purposeful actualization of classical values in teaching process towards the end of the 16th century. Well, although the humanism in Riga didn't last long and had local character, although even the educated noblemen valued political and mercantile interests higher than profound education or cultural aspirations, classical values, mastering of Greek and Latin, study of ancient texts, views and thoughts, ideas, ethical and aesthetical ideals derived from classical authors had their place in education processes in the region and particularly in pedagogical activities of Riga Dome School. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for one short question. Did I discourage you? Well, we will have thank you very much. We will have the time afterwards, can discuss, and I will be happy to discuss with you because it's a subject I like very much, the one you have talked about. Now, the next speaker is Kajsa Sjöberg, my colleague from Lund University. She is one of those who was here for the first Colloquium Balticum Rigense. Then she spoke about a religious author. Now it's time for science. Please, Kajsa, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Dear Colloquium Balticum colleagues and friends, let's begin about 5,000 years ago. And let's go to China.
I think
I would ask
okay.
The Empress of China sits in her garden and in the shadow of a big mulberry tree, having her afternoon tea, when suddenly something falls down into her tea from the tree above. What can it be? Well, at first it looks like an egg, but then when it comes into the hot water, it dissolves into a very, very thin and very, very long thread. This is, according to the legend, the fantastic beginning of the story of silk. Yes, it was in China it all started. Oh, we have a picture. Got it. It was so...
No, I'm sorry. It's on the desktop. You just have to click on it.
Pardon?
The presentation is on the desktop.
It is on the... How do I get into it? It's on the...
Simply click on this like that.
Thank you. So, now... It was in China it all started. But sericulture, the making of silk, it spread, and as time went by, wonderful silk was made also in Japan, in India, Persia, and so on. The silken fabrics spread over even longer distances and reached Greece and Rome during antiquity. Pliny the Elder speaks of bombyx, or the silk moth. Bombyx is the Latin and Greek name for the silk moth, in his Historia Naturalis, saying that the moths, they texunt ad vestem luxumque feminarum, quae bombycina appellatur. They weave a luxurious clothing material for women called silk. But not only women liked this elegant fabric. It didn't take long until you also could see Roman men dressed in silk. During the reign of Emperor Tiberius, however, the Senate decided to forbid men from wearing silk garments. Tacitus writes in his Annales that it was decretum ne vestis serica viros foidaret. Among the emperors, those who were characterized by severity of manners, like Tiberius, always wanted to restrict the use of silk, while Caligula and others with a predilection for luxury and excess not only encouraged it in the female sex, but liked to wear it themselves. We can read about that in Suetonius' Vita Caligulae. Other Roman authors mention the elegant silk too. For instance, the poets, Horace and Virgil and Ovid and Propertius and Tibullus, they all mention silk in different places. Obviously, the fabric of silk was well known in Greece and Rome in antiquity, and we know that Chinese silk was one of the most expensive luxury goods imported by them. But although the silk was very popular, they still knew nothing about the art of silk making, the so-called sericulture, until about 550 Anno Domini. And then, according to the legend again, monks working for the emperor Justinian I smuggled silkworm eggs in hollow canes from China to Constantinople. But it didn't really spread from there to the rest of Europe for several hundreds of years. Then later on, Italy became the first and most important producer of silk in Europe. Other countries followed, for instance, France, Spain, Holland, England, Germany. And at last, in the 18th century, even Sweden and Finland made some serious attempts. How come? Well, at that time, it was well known that it was not good for a country to have bigger import than export. They thought that you should import as little as possible, and the goal was to produce what you needed within the borders of your country. All the same, the trading with fine porcelain, Chinese silk, spices, and other expensive products from the East was constantly increasing. The balance of trade was not good at all in Sweden, and the government decided to do something about it. Now, plantation gets more important than ever. So is finding good plants and alternatives for products you usually buy from other countries. The key word during this time is utility, utilitas, and the spirit of the time is very optimistic. So why not make our own silk? Attempts will be made in a couple of places in Sweden and in Lund, for instance. here you see two men. The man to the left is probably well known. Yes, it's Carl Linnaeus, and he doesn't need a closer presentation, does he? The other man, Erik Gustav Lidbeck. I should say something about him. He was a disciple of Linné, and many other disciples are much more known than Lidbeck, partly because of their adventures far away from home. But Lidbeck, he stayed in Sweden, striving in the Linnaean spirit in his way. He combined his studies in botanics with studies in economics, which was a natural combination at that time. And when he became professor at the University of Lund, 1756, he also, at the same time, became a director for the planting office in Skåne, in the southern part of Sweden. So, being professor at the university and planting director in one person, he had one foot in academy and the other in society, and treated issues about the public utility also in his academic profession. A mission of his was to make people plant more. About half of the dissertations with him as praeses deals with the utility of planting. So when the Swedish government had decided to minimize the import of different goods, for instance silk, Linné and some other men, among those Lidbeck, started to investigate the possibilities for silk making in Sweden. And during his scientific expedition, during Linné's scientific expedition to Skåne, 1749, Linné, he had seen a lot of mulberry trees. So obviously, the mulberry tree could grow in our climate. And about the mulberry tree, you see, the mulberry trees is, without them, it's impossible to keep silkworms, because the silkworms must eat the leaves from the mulberry trees. And preferably from the white kind, the white mulberry, the Morus alba. Now Lidbeck is given the task of supplying with mulberry tree leaves to the silkworms in Lund. And within a couple of years, Lidbeck had more than 100,000 mulberry trees planted in Lund, only in little Lund. And he was also taking care of the silkworms. And that wasn't easy, because sometimes it was too cold for the little creatures, and since the smoke from the stove was bad for their health, Lidbeck had to keep them warm in his bed during the nights. And here you can see how they look, the silkworm to the right down here. And the eggs and the worms. And the mulberry tree leaves and the mulberries. You can see here that the mulberries, they change color when they ripen. At first they are white and then almost black when they are ripe. But you probably knew that already if you have read Pyramus et Tisbe. You recognize it? You know, the tree where the Pyramus et Tisbe, they decide to meet after sunset. It's a tree with a lot of white fruit, which during the metamorphosis changes color to dark purple, almost black, as a result of what happens in the tragic story. So obviously, Ovid's tree is a black mulberry tree, a Morus nigra. Lidbeck describes different species of Morus. The three most important for sericulture are the white, the black, and the red. And today we know of more than 1,000 species of morus. And there is also the moth, the Phalena bombyx. The Linnaean name of the species now, and since 1758, is Bombyx mori, the mulberry bombyx, the mulberry silk moth. So Lidbeck did not only plant mulberry trees and make others do so, he also wrote about the white mulberry tree and the plantation of it. In a dissertation, at least he was praeses for this dissertation. And this is one of 3 dissertations about silk from that time, which I'm going to tell you about. The first one is about the silk moth, Dissertatio de Phalena bombyce, with praeses Carl Linnaeus, not yet knighted von Linné. The second one is a dissertation in economy about sericulture. And the third one is one about the white mulberry. And I have translated and made comments to these 3 dissertations, which will be published in a few months by the Royal Swedish Academy of Agriculture and Forestry. They are interested in this, which is very nice, isn't it? The first one is the shortest, 12 pages. The second is the longest one, 35 pages, and the third is somewhere in between. All of them tell the history of silk, especially the long dissertation in economics. This dissertation, the one about the cultura bombycum et serisi, is the one that has a lot of references to authors from antiquity. While the Lidbeck dissertation about the white mulberry tree has less, and the Linné dissertation about the Phalena bombyx has no references to authors at all from antiquity. On the other hand, the Linné dissertation has a lot of references to authors from the 17th and 18th century, more than the others in proportion to their length. But now we will look at some references to authors from antiquity. There are different kinds of references. We find direct quotes, that's one kind of reference, but also references to authors, just saying that a person has treated a certain subject. There can be references to certain historical episodes from antiquity. That's also an antique reference, I think. And we have references to words. During this time, they are very interested in words and explain them in every possible way, through dictionaries, not at least. One source in this De Cultura Bombycum is Rigense, for instance. So they are very interested in words, in Greek words and Latin words. And so there are different kinds of references. There are also different purposes of using the references. And I draw a line between the quotes in the beginning and the end of a dissertation, where they all are used to decorate more than to be a part of an argumentation. Let's look at some examples. First from De Mora Alba. In the beginning there, this is a typical one. Ut quimus quam ut volumus non licet, as we can, or according to our ability, when it's not possible as we want. A typical excuse: I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy this, but I will do my best. Then he starts to talk about silk and refers to what others have thought about this. Video sericas vestes, si vestes vocandae sunt, in quibus nihil est, quod defendi aut corpus aut denique pudor possit. At the end, a common thing again, praetere at qualiis post me memoranda relinquo. I say nothing more and leave to others after me to tell. Let's go to the one with most quotations now. Okay. Time flies. Tempus fugit. He talks about his science of economics, which is an ornamentum pacis et subsidium belli from Cicero. Then he excused himself. I do respect the elders, but I want to try something new, which we need now. Laudamus veteres, sed nostris utimur annis. Then in the argumentation for letting the mulberry worms eat the right food, he refers to Ovid about giving the different animals eat different things. And he refers to Virgil, Timor pascentur apes dum rore cicadae. And then he wants to tell us about how healthy it is to eat mulberry berries, ille salubres aestates peraget qui nigris prandia moris finiet. He who finishes his meals with black mulberries will live healthy summers. We have also in this dissertation a lot of references to historical events during antiquity, to words. He mentions Vopiscus, Jordanes, Lapidius, Procopius, Pliny the Elder, Propertius, Pausanias, and others. So, I will end now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
All these three, but before I end, okay. All these three dissertations the authors to all these three dissertations do believe in the idea of Swedish sericulture and emphasize that it would be something good for the national economy. But in real life, the climate was so problematic both for the silkworms and for the mulberry trees. But so it didn't take long before they had to give up these attempts. But all the same, during a couple of years, they did manage to produce silk in Lund, though not very much. And this is a proof. This is made in Lund.
Nice.
Yes, it is. So believe me.
Now I do.
And I will end with showing you the first photo again, because I think it's a good summary for this presentation. Since this has something to do with silk, with economics, and with botany. But what is this then? You can see it's something made of silk. That's right. Economy. Well, this is a wallet. This is a silk wallet. And what about botany? Yes, there are flowers on it, but one more thing. This wallet, once upon a time, belonged to Linné himself. And thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, a question perhaps to Kajsa. Well, it seems I discourage people from asking questions, but still we are short of time.
I talk too long, I'm sorry.
Yes, we are short of time, so I suggest we continue.
Thank you.
The last the last speakers of this session are Eva Kallnina and Martins Leissans, and it's Eva who is going to.
Martins is
Yeah. You have changed your title into a German one.
Yeah.
So I suppose you give the title yourself.
Mein Vortrag ist in Deutsch. Johann Gotthelf Lindner und das Schuldrama. Unser Vortrag ist entschuldigen, kann man dieses?
Oh yes.
Folgenderweise strukturiert. Johann Gotthelf Lindners Lebenslauf. Johann Lindner als Rektor der Riger Domschule. Und der dritte Teil ist Johann Gotthelf Lindners Ansichten über das Schuldrama und den von den ihm verfassenden Schuldramen gewidmet. Johann Gotthelf Lindners Lebenslauf. Johann Gotthelf Lindner ist Johann Gotthelf Lindner ist am 11. September 1729 in Pommer, in Schmolsinn, heute das ist Poland, in einer Pastorfamilie geboren. In der deutsch-baltischen Gesellschaft ist der Name Lindner gut bekannt. Lindners Brüder waren bekannte Ärzte. Mit hervorragenden Leistungen lernte er an der Friedrichsschule in Königsberg. Danach studierte er auch in Königsberg, wo sein Vater seit 1733 als Schulrat, Professor und Pastor arbeitete. Im Jahr 1744 erhielt er das akademische Bürgerrecht. 1750 wurde Lindner Philosophie-Magister. Er hatte sich auf Französisch, Geschichte, Mathematik, Oratoria und Dichtung spezialisiert. Seit dem 21. März bis zum 22. März 1765 war er Rektor der Domschule und Inspektor. 1765 wird er zum ordentlichen Professor für Dichtung an der Königsberger Universität berufen, wo er auch Inspektor des Rates der Friedrichsschule wird. Eine Zeit lang hält er sich in Petersburg auf, wo er als dritter Prediger an der Petrikirche und sogar als Direktor der Petrischule tätig ist. 1773 wird er in Königsberg Doktor der Theologie. 1775 aber wird er Kirchen- und Schulrat sowie auch Pastor in Löbenicht. Lindner stirbt 1776 in Königsberg. Johann Lindner als Rektor der Riger Domschule. Die Zeit nach dem Großen Nordischen Krieg und nach der Erweilung Rigas in Russland war für Riga, für den Riger Dom als zuständiger Institution für die Domschule sowie auch für die Schule selbst eine recht komplizierte Zeit, sowohl finanziell als auch politisch, weil sich die Stadt und die Schule den Gesetzen und dem Schulsystem Russlands unterordnen mussten. Die Domschule musste einer starken Konkurrenz standhalten, weil die andere Riger Schule, die 1675 gegründete Schule Caroline, später zum Riger Lyzeum umbenannt und von den Zaren Russlands, der Verwandten Peters I. unterstützt, staatliche Finanzierung bekam. Als aber Lydner nach Riga kam, hatte sich finanzielle Situation schon so verbessert, dass man gut ausgebildete, wenn auch pädagogisch unerfahrene junge Lehrer einstellen könnte. Die offizielle Einführung an der Domschule fand am 8. Mai 1755 von 8 bis 11 Uhr statt. Im Unterschied zu seinen Vorgängern hatte Lydner seine Rede nach Aufforderung des Riger Rates in deutscher und nicht in lateinischer Sprache verfasst. Das war erstmals. Die Ideen der Aufklärung und die Forderung Russlands hinsichtlich Politik und Schulen waren nach Riga gekommen und deswegen hatte eine besondere Kommission am Riger Rat Veränderungen in der Lektionskatalog ausgearbeitet, die von Lydner durchgeführt wurden. Unterricht in Hebräischen wurde zum Privatunterricht. Statt des Lehrbuchs Danzische Grammatik wurde Rausche Grammatik eingeführt. Die Buchtitel kommt von Johann Andres Danzens Version der Hebräischen Grammatik und nun sollten stattdessen ein neueres Lehrbuch Einführung in Althebräisches von Joachim Rustus Rau verwendet werden, aber nur in Privatunterricht. Von 1727 bis 1764 haben die Zarinnen Russlands Katharina I. und Elisabeth Petrovna die Ukaz über die Verbannung der Juden aus Riga und Kurland erlassen. Das widerspiegelte sich auch in Schulprogrammen. Außerdem wurden statt 2 Stunden des Plutarch-Kurses Metaphysik und Physik eingeführt, die Oratorie von 4 auf 3 Stunden zugunsten der allgemeinen Historie reduziert. In die Lehrpläne wurden die Privatstunden in Französisch aufgenommen, statt Antiquitätenstunden kamen Studien eines griechischen Autors. Rektor selbst betonte, dass das Studium des Griechischen des Neuen Testaments intensiver würde. Selbstverständlich blieben Latein und Griechisch in der Lehrplänen sowie Erlernten der Texte von Cicero, Ovid, Horaz, Livius und Tatius erhalten. Das ist nur eine Auswahl. In Lydners Zeit wurde Unterrichtsbeginn im Winter von 7 auf 8 verlegt, damit die Schüler keine Halsschmerzen bekommen. An einigen Tagen wurde der Unterricht bis 5 Uhr verlängert, um die unteren Klassen zusätzlich Naturgeschichte, Universalgeschichte, Geographie zu unterrichten. Privat konnte man auch die Arithmetik lernen. In der Schule wurden in jeder Klasse Prüfungen eingeführt, zu deren Beginn der Lehrer den Anwesenden eine Ansprache in lateinischer Sprache hielt. Indem man den Ideen der Aufklärung folgte und der neuen politischen Situation gerecht wurde, wurde Verwendung der lateinischen Sprache bei verschiedenen feierlichen Anlässen reduziert. Die Bedeutung der deutschen Sprache nahm zu. Die Reden wurden auf Deutsch gehalten, Latein wurde in Ansprachen, Dankesangungen und Lobreden verwendet, die Lydner hervorragend verfassen konnte. Sie waren ausführlich, eloquent, mit vielen Epitheten, Vergleichen und Aufrufezeichen. Nach seinem ersten Auftritt zusammen mit dem Schüler, der anlässlich der Geburtstagsfeier der russischen Kaiserin Elisabeth stattfand, und wo die Schüler die Reden auf Deutsch und Französisch hielten, lateinische Hexameterstrophen und deutsche Gedichte vortrugen, beschloss der Rigaer Rat, dass bei weiteren Feierlichkeiten am Geburtstag und Krönungstag der Kaiserin Liedner feierliche Veranstaltungen organisieren und das Festprogramm veröffentlichen muss. Der Rektor kümmerte sich um die soziale Versicherung. Auf Initiative der Schule beschloss der Rigaer Rat, dass, Zitat, den Witten und Weißen der Lehrer die Hälfte des Gehalts und der sonstigen Einnahmen für ein Jahr vom Nachfolger gezahlt werde. In demselben Jahr wird die Ausstellung eines Kollaborators beschlossen und durchgeführt. Er sollte in den oberen Klassen arbeiten und dort die Kenntnisse des Lateins, der Deutschen, der Epistologie, Naturgeschichte und Geografie festigen. 1964 wurde noch eine Stelle des Kollaborators bewilligt und Liedner berief Herder als Lehrer der unteren Klassen nach Riga. Herder kam nach Riga im Februar 1764. Die Domschule hatte 4 Klassen. In Liedners Zeit wurden 181 Schüler aufgenommen. Sehr oft lernten in der gleichen Zeit Brüder oder nahe Verwandte, zum Beispiel Martin Glock, Valentin Glock, Johann Heinrich Dent, Peter Herbertin. In 2 Jahren wurden nur 6 oder 8 Schüler aufgenommen. In der anderen 15 bis 26 Schüler. Es ist schwierig festzustellen, wie lange jeder Schüler gelernt hatte und wie viele Schüler in einem Jahr überhaupt gelernt haben. Aber die Programme der Schuldramen zeugen davon, dass die mehrere Familiennamen regelmäßig wiederholen, zum Beispiel Melchior Adam Schulz, Eberhard David Wintig, Adam Heinrich Schwarz. Liedners Interesse für die Schüler ist im Rektorbuch zu sehen. Er hat auch seinen Schülern die Empfehlungsschreiben mit nach Königsburg gegeben, die an den damaligen Privatdozent Immanuel Kant adressiert waren. Die Tätigkeit Liedners als Rektor der Domschule war erfolgreich. In seiner Zeit nahm die Zahl der Schüler zu. Bei dem nächsten Rektor ging sie zurück. Johann Gotthelf Liedner als Autor des Schuldramas. Die Entstehungszeit des Schuldramas war das 16. Jahrhundert. Und das war mit der Verbreitung der Ideen des Humanismus und Protestantismus in Europa verbunden. Im 16. Jahrhundert sind die Schuldramen mehrmals in Riga aufgeführt. 1519 und nun so weiter. Der berühmteste Rigaer Autor war Rektor Domschule Stefan Teuthorn. Aber der einzige Text, der erhalten geblieben ist, Burkhard Waldis, der parallel von Forlorn Sohn, die 1525 in Riga aufgeführt wurde. Das Schuldrama und Theater waren von 16. bis 18. Jahrhundert auch in dem katholischen Milieu an der Jesuitenkollegs- und Klosterschulen gut bekannt. Hier herrschen Latein, prächtige Kostüme, Dekorationen, entwickelte Bühnentechnik, große Massenszenen. Das Theater der protestantischen Schulen war im 18. Jahrhundert nur in einigen Orten Deutschlands zu treffen. Als 1758 Liedner das erste Schuldrama aufführte, betonte er, dass obwohl die Rigaer die katholischen Traditionen besser kennen, auch in den protestantischen Milieu die Traditionen des Schuldramas bekannt und akzeptabel ist. Diese Gedanken führte in Einleitung zur Sammlungen der Schuldramen, Beitrag zu Schulhandlungen, Vorrede, Anmerkungen über das Schuldrama weiter aus. Schrieb, dass die katholischen Schuldramen ängstlichen Menschen in Angst versetzen würden. Die Schuldramen von Lindners fanden ohne Kostüme, ohne Dekorationen statt. Es dominierte Monologe und Dialoge. Das protestantische Schuldrama war asketisch. Es hatte sich von den katholischen Schuldramen und Platztheater Theater auf Domplatz zu unterscheiden. Die von Lindner verfassten und veröffentlichten Schuldramen sind Abdalonumus, die Krönung Göffrig von Bolton, Albert, die Gründung von Riga und der wiedererkehrte Sohn. Alle Dramen sind in deutscher Sprache verfasst worden. Sie haben 3 Quellen. Bibel, das Thema des verlorenen Sohns, ist in der protestantischen Schuldrama populär. Rigaer Geschichte, die das Gedächtnis der Schüler als Teil ihrer sozialen und nationalen Identität bilden soll, und das klassische Erbe, das zur Bildung des Menschen gehört. Es ist selbstverständlich, dass die unterschiedlichen Quellen dem Erziehungsprozess vielseitige Möglichkeiten bieten. Lindner schrieb auch andere Arbeiten, die Merkmale des Dramas aufweisen, zum Beispiel die Gespräche, die 4 Temperamente oder Dialoge. Telemach findet seinen Vater Ulrich wieder. Jede Aufführung war komplex. So wurde im Programm zum Schuldrama Abdalonumus gesagt, dass die Veranstaltung der Krönungstag der Imperatorin Elisabeth gewidmet ist und der Erziehung der Kinder dienen soll. Lindners Rede von der Aufführung ist die Adel aus dem arabischen Märchen gewidmet. Danach wird Elisabeth in deutscher Sprache gewürdigt. Nur praktisch, das ist etwas 4-5 Stunden, diese alles zusammengeht. Lindner hatte die theoretischen Grundlagen des Schuldramas studiert und versuchte sie in seinen Texten realisieren. Die Vorrede zeigt, dass Lindner Schuldrama charakterisiert aus der Sicht der Pädagogik und Didaktik. Die das Schuldrama charakterisierenden Teile sind Plan, Episoden, Knoten, Handlung, Moral, Charakter, Situationen mit Affekten und Wohlstand, die innere Überzeugung der Charaktere, Aussehen der Schauspieler. Lindner ist der Auffassung, dass die Einheit von Handlung, Zeit und Ort beachtet werden muss. Besonders betont Lindner, dass Verwirklichung nicht allzu tief zu sein soll und böse Charaktere auch möglich seien, damit die Schüler das Leben besser verstehen und die Handlung entstehen könnte. Das Böse ist in den Menschen, kommt nur von Unkenntnis oder Irrtum. Die Charaktere, die von dem Schüler gespielt werden, müssen tugendhaft sein. Die Grundlage des Schuldramas Abdalonumus sind die Ereignisse aus der Geschichte Alexander des Großen, dargestellt von Quintus Curtius Rufus. Der Handlungsort ist Sidon, 302 vor Christus. Ja, verstanden. Und die Hauptfiguren ist nur Alexander der Große, Reises, Straton, Abdalomus, ein Boot, 2 Junge und Festus. Die Position, das ist die Arbeit von, die Quelle ist antike Literatur. Antike Kultur. Lindners Schuldramen gibt es statische Dialoge und wenig Handlung. Es versuchte, die Traditionen des Schuldramas zu erneuern. Im 18. Jahrhundert gab es schon ein anderes Drama und eine andere Theorie des Dramas im europäischen Kulturraum. In Riga gab es kein ständiges Theater und die Zuschauer fanden Lindners Schauspiele gut, wenn auch die Lage der Aufführungen sie müde machte. Das ist in einer Rezension. Aber in Deutschland wurden seine theoretischen Ansichten sowohl von Hamann als auch Abt kritisiert. Es wäre nicht klar, wer der Adressat der Schauspieler sei. Unklar sei, auch solche Schauspieler für die Schulen geeignet sind. Unklar sei auch seine Vorstellung vom Drama. Und Schlussfolgerungen: Zu Lindners Zeit an der Domschule begann das Studium der antiken Welt von exakten und zeitgenössischen Wissenschaften zurückwiesen. Die Bedeutung der lateinischen Sprache in der Schulen- und Gesellschaft verringerte sich. Die Vielfalt der pädagogischen Methoden trug dazu bei, dass das Kennenlernen der antiken Welt durch die Schuldramen und anderen dramatischen Formen vermittelt wurde.
Thank you very much. We have had 4 very interesting speeches in this session, but regrettably very little time for discussion. But we will meet all of us together at the lunch in an hour's time, I think, and then we can take the questions, if it's okay for all of you, on a personal basis. Okay, I think we have finished for...
Thank you all for these 2 really nice and interesting sessions, but I have an announcement. You know that despite all our attempts to save time, it turned into a total fiasco. But we all know that the lunch is the most important part of every show, in every conference. So, in your nice programs, designed as an old-fashioned book, is written that now it's time for a book exhibition. You see that? Of course.